Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicos. Today is August 11th, 2017, and this is episode 47. Politicos is a podcast that explores what's happening in British Columbia and across the country. If you haven't already, please make sure to subscribe and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter where we're at PoliticosPod, and support the show at patreon.com/politicos. I'm Ian, and this is a second sort of special edition episode. I'm in Ottawa right now, so I've had the chance to sit down with a number of other podcasters and have a number of sort of fun conversations. In today's episode, we have interviews with Katie Gibbs, who's the Executive Director of Evidence for Democracy, and a sort of crossover clip from my recent appearance on the Docket podcast, which is, I guess, Canada's premier law podcast. And we talk about the recent sort of kerfuffle around the Supreme Court of Canada's almost reversal of its decision on who gets to intervene in the Trinity Western University case. This is a personal interest to me since I work with one of the interveners in that case. Everything I say in that episode is, of course, my own personal opinion. It doesn't represent anyone I work for or am on any boards for, but I hope you enjoy it. Scott's in Vancouver, so he's not part of either of these interviews, but we'll be back with our regular show next week, and we'll do regular roundups of what's been happening in the last couple of weeks. Finally, I also appeared on the latest episode of the Boys in Short Pants podcast to talk about some of the political stories of the week. That episode should be online later today or tomorrow. Hopefully SoundCloud doesn't crash in the meantime, and otherwise you can find them on Twitter at ShortPantsPod. Make sure to check out the Docket at michaelspratt.com and find Evidence for Democracy at evidencefordemocracy.ca. Hey, well, thanks for sitting down with me, Dr. Katie Gibbs of Evidence for Democracy. Maybe you could introduce yourself and tell me a bit about how you got involved with Evidence for Democracy.
Sure. So I'm the Executive Director of Evidence for Democracy, and we're a nonprofit organization that basically promotes the transparent use of evidence in government decision-making. My background is as a scientist, so I did my PhD on looking at causes of threats to endangered species. And I was always really interested in science for informing policy, especially in conservation. That usually is the focus, is, you don't just want to do science for the sake of doing science. You're really interested in that science being used. And I grew sort of more and more frustrated during the years of my thesis that it seemed like science was almost never used in decision making. And so I was sort of getting more and more frustrated over that. At the same time, this time period was when the Harper government was in power, and, sort of slowly, bit by bit, there were all these stories of research facilities being dismantled, things like the long-form census being eliminated. And, in our lab group, we would all, sit around over lunch and talk about how, not just frustrating, but, really just shocking and outrageous this was, that in this day and age, we had a government that was, dismantling research and ignoring evidence and muzzling scientists. And so all of that was kind of percolating, and at the same time, I also did a lot of political volunteer work in my spare time. And so then when I was getting close to finishing my degree, it was actually a bunch of the professors in our department came into our lab, poked their head in, and were kind of like, we're having this meeting at the pub to talk about organizing something to show that the science community is really upset with these policies. And so I went to this meeting, and we had this amazing brainstorming session for this Death of Evidence rally. And then at the end of the meeting, it was basically this game of hot potato of who's actually going to organize it. And all of the professors who called this meeting, were sort of like, oh, not us, this would be way better if it's coming from the younger students, you guys should take the ball and run with it. And so I volunteered to kind of take on a lead in organizing that, partly because I was basically done. I had written my thesis, so I had some time, and I had a fair bit of experience sort of organizing and managing volunteers and that kind of thing. So we organized this event, and, we were expecting maybe a few hundred people. We were not expecting anything big. And then the day of the event ended up getting thousands of scientists, and, it really just became a much bigger thing than any of us had imagined it would be, and got tons of media attention. And so, after that, I did go back and actually defend my thesis, and then was kind of, left with that question of, what am I going to do now? And this whole time I had kind of been, just personally trying to think of a career that would bring together all of these interests of science, policy, campaigning, social change. And then at the same time, we had so many people asking after the rally, that was amazing, what's next? And we kept hearing from scientists who this was the first time they had ever done anything like this. This was the first time they had ever participated in a protest or a rally, the first time they had ever made a sign, and they were so invigorated by it, and they didn't know where else to put that. And, there are a lot of great science organizations in Canada, but especially at that time, under the Harper government, everyone was very sort of afraid of doing advocacy type work. And so, most organizations were really staying clear of anything that, could be considered criticizing the government. And so it seemed like there was the need for a new organization, that was incorporating advocacy amongst other work. And also, really not just focusing on science promotion in the sense of, science is cool, it's neat, but really focusing more on that angle of how science impacts society and democracy and critical thinking and evidence-based decision-making and all of those aspects of it. And so, it was just this great opportunity of this need for an organizations to do that work, and, really great timing that it was just this intersection of all the things that I was passionate about. So I decided to, why not try starting an organization? And that was about 4 or 5 years ago, and here we are today.
So you basically, that protest was like Canada's mini science march before they even had to get to that in the States. And I think since then, we've had a lot of media come to you personally to say, what do the American scientists need to do now with Trump pushing those same kind of threats? Maybe you could sort of expand on that and what that's been like.
Yeah, it was an interesting time too. I was actually on maternity leave, and when Trump, got elected, I really normally I'm a news junkie, but I was just like, I can't. It's too bad news. I was like, I am on maternity leave. I'm not listening to the news. I'm just tuning it out. And then there was a lot of media interest in requesting interviews for me to comment on what was going on in the U.S. So I basically had to sit down and get caught up on weeks worth of terrible news of what Trump had been doing to science, just in those first few weeks. And it was, really shocking and depressing, and, sort of that simultaneously just so discouraged by what was happening, and then simultaneously inspired by how quickly scientists mobilized. And that's really, where the difference was. And I even heard from a lot of people in the U.S. that it was partly because they had seen what had happened in Canada was why they mobilized so quickly. They didn't sort of take a wait and see approach. Whereas in Canada, under Harper, we let things slowly degrade for a very long time before scientists really got mad and got out in the streets. And, certainly in the U.S., we didn't see that. We saw people see where things were going and say, we're not going to wait for things to get there. We're going to start mobilizing now. And so it's been inspiring to see. There was a science march as well, but obviously there was also the 314 campaign of trying to get scientists to run for office, which is really great. So, yeah.
In 2015, we had the Justin Trudeau Liberals sweep to a majority victory, and Justin Trudeau used the phrase evidence-based policy quite a bit in his campaign. He talked specifically about the erosion of science that was a big feature in most of the opposition parties' platforms. So everything's better now, right?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to, note that didn't happen by chance. That was really a lot of work going on behind the scenes of lobbying the parties before the election to make them focus on science issues. So, I think that's a really good example of the kind of power that the science community can yield when they choose to do something. It doesn't just happen on its own by chance. It was great the extent to which the Liberals and the other parties ran on science issues, and obviously the Liberals got elected, and there's no doubt there has been improvements. I think it would be ridiculous to say that things aren't better for science now than they were, but it doesn't mean that everything is fixed, especially given just how badly things were degraded over the Harper decade. We still have a long way to go. You can't undo all of that in a year or two. So particularly on the sort of muzzling file, there has been really good progress on that. So it's actually it didn't get that much media attention because the good news stories never do, but the government did agree to a clause in the collective agreement for government scientists, basically saying that they have a right to speak about their work. So that is huge because it's actually in their binding union contract. It makes it really, really hard for future governments to change that. It's not something that future governments can easily undo. So that's huge. They also agreed to create science integrity policies in all departments that have more than 10 scientists. So there's been a lot of progress on that file, and it's still not fixed. Part of my concern is around the culture within government. That takes a long time to change, and I'm sure there are many scientists who their whole career in the government was under the Harper years. So, they sort of get in this habit, and there is this culture of not talking to anyone about your work. And so that does take time to change, but there's definitely been huge improvements. The biggest area where we're still waiting for more things to change is really when it comes down to the money. Both funding for academic research and government funding for internal government research are both still lagging. When you look at how Canada is doing compared to other countries, it's pretty abysmal in terms of how much we put towards research as a percentage of our GDP. So that's really where we're still looking to see what the Liberals are going to do.
One of the things the Liberals did do is bring forward this Naylor Commission to write a report on the state of science integrity, because a good way to sort of distance yourself from the previous government is to commission a study. Maybe talk us through whether this was a valuable exercise or kind of one of those glossy, doesn't actually look in, sort of like what it seems like the Missing Murdered Indigenous Women Commission might be going to. You don't have to comment on that.
Yeah.
And then what did they find, and what are the prospects for that?
Well, so one of the first things the science minister did was commission this report on so-called fundamental research. So research that sort of isn't applied, where scientists can just sort of do interesting work for them. It's not like research that is trying to lead towards commercialization of a product or something. And so they commissioned this report to basically, understand what is what is the status of fundamental research in Canada? What are the different players? How are they working together? And I think that was a good move. It had been a long time since there had been an assessment like this. Basically the government was saying, well, if we're going to put money back in, we want to at least make sure we're putting it in the right place. Mm-hmm. So first we're going to do this assessment, see, how much money is needed, see where it needs to go. I think that was great. The report itself is actually quite incredible. It's thorough, it's comprehensive. I think it's quite rare for these reports, and especially within the science community, to see the kind of unanimous support that this report is getting. So, so many top name scientists all across the country are speaking out vocally in favor of the recommendations in this report, which is rare. Normally these things come out and you see people criticizing it, saying, oh, well, why didn't you focus on this? Why didn't you focus on this? So really, I think the degree to which the community is behind this report is actually quite incredible. The report does make some really big suggestions, namely funding. So they recommend, I believe it's $1.3 billion investment over 4 years. They looked a lot at the balance of government funding going towards this investigator-led research versus more applied research, and found that the equation was out of whack, and so that any new funding really needs to go to this investigator-led research. They did look at how Canada was doing compared to other countries and confirmed what was well known, that Canada is dramatically falling behind other countries. They also recommended some more sort of nerdy things, like trying to get the tri-councils that fund academic research to work together, cooperate more, create more sort of standards among them so that it was less willy-nilly between each one.
And that's basically the NRC, SHRC, and the health one. So
yes,
the natural sciences, the social sciences, and the health
CIHR for health, and CIRC for natural sciences, and SHRC for social sciences. And they also recommended creating what they're calling NACRI, which is sort of a new National Advisory Council on Science, which I think is something that is much needed. So they, put out these big sort of bold recommendations. This was in April when the report came out. And what's really, missing right now is the response from the government to the report. So, the government commissioned the report, said, well, we're not going to put in the big dollars yet. We're going to wait and see what this report said. The report confirmed that big dollars are needed, said where to put them. And so far, the government hasn't really responded to the report almost at all. So that's really sort of what we're waiting for. And so us at Evidence for Democracy, we have a campaign right now called Rebuilding Research that is basically allowing scientists, researchers, Canadians who care about science to send a message to their MP asking them to support implementing these report recommendations. And we're really seeing a lot of mobilization within the science community. There's another group that has done sort of like a student letter, like students supporting the report. We've also researchers have actually been getting meetings with their MPs all across the summer, all across Canada over the summer while their MPs are back in their ridings to talk about the importance of fundamental research and the NAILA report. So we're waiting to see what the government does in September and in the next budget.
And where can people find the call to action, as it were?
They can find that at rebuildingresearch.ca.
Great. Well, let's move to the more provincial scene. We were talking earlier, you mentioned that Evidence for Democracy did some research on how the BC government was doing, at least the previous BC government under Christy Clark, and this was your sort of first time looking at a provincial level. What did you sort of look at? What did you find? And how is BC doing?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting. So back under the Harper government, we did a report called Can Scientists Speak, looking at the communication policies for federal government scientists. And when that came out, we had a lot of people asking us, well, is the same thing happening provincially? Are provincial scientists being muzzled? And we tried to look up any information we could, and we could not find anything at all talking about what was happening in provincial science. So this is something we really wanted to do, was start looking at these same issues provincially. We had heard a lot of complaints coming from BC, the sort of anecdotes that things weren't great. So we decided to start there. And so we actually did a survey of provincial government scientists in BC to sort of gauge what their concerns were, what the problems were. And it was actually quite different from what we found federally. So the muzzling issue, which is what we had definitely found as the big thing federally, was not that much of an issue in BC. There were still some concerns there, but most scientists felt like they did have to get permission, but usually they did. So they weren't very concerned about it. But the biggest problem that I found really quite baffling is BC has something called professional reliance. So this is a fairly unique thing to BC, where the government, very explicitly laid off a lot of government scientists and sort of outsourced the work that normally would be done by government scientists to sort of they call them professional biologists. And so basically contracting it out. But often the people who are doing this work, which is often things like environmental assessments, often they're scientists or contractors who actually work for the companies who are putting in the project proposals. So there's a huge potential conflict of interest there. And it's not uncommon for that to happen where you have contractors doing environmental assessments. But the big problem in BC is that there was such little actual government science capacity that there weren't enough government scientists to even be sort of overseeing the work done by contractors. So there was this oversight piece that is really missing due to a lack of science capacity within the province. And that was highlighted by scientists as the main concern, was really this lack of capacity to be overseeing the scientific work that was happening, that mostly had to do with things like environmental assessments for resource development projects.
So would the solution basically be for the new government to inject money to be able to hire environmental assessors and other scientists in the departments where they would need it?
That's a big part of it, but I think it also is likely going to require even more of an overhaul of the environmental assessment system. But definitely, at the very least, there's a need to put in place some more oversight for this environmental assessment work that's being done. And I think it makes a lot of sense to be bringing more of that work back into government and to government employees who sort of by definition at least should be working in the public interest.
I don't know if you followed our election closely enough to look at any of the platforms, but did any of the parties come forward with things that might address some of these issues that you were aware of, or were you sort of too Ottawa focused here?
I tried to follow it. It seemed like there wasn't a lot of meaty policy discussion in the BC election.
It was more tolls and
I didn't really see these issues being discussed that much. But I have certainly heard from the new government, and I think your departments have weird names that I can never remember, but I was looking at the mandate letters, and one of them did actually mention this professional reliance issue as something that is on their file. So we're definitely optimistic that something is actually going to be done about the system now that there's a new government.
Right. Are there any other provinces you're planning to look at next?
Well, so interesting things are happening in Ontario as well. Ontario just sort of quietly, with little fanfare, announced that they're also creating a chief science officer position. And unlike federally, they've actually moved quite quickly on it and they're actually currently doing the search right now and plan to have someone in place by November. So that's really great. So we are looking at doing something in Ontario, but it probably won't be the same kind of thing, but looking to do something to sort of, help them in this positive work that's already happening here.
What are your thoughts on the announcement of Julie Payette as the next Governor General of Canada?
Oh, well, I mean, that's a great question. Certainly I was happy to see that. I think given the science minister has made it really clear that women in science is a big focus for her. So I don't think it was too surprising given the government's priorities. But I think things like that make a big difference. For little girls, seeing that kind of a role model is nothing but positive.
Is there anything else you're working on at Evidence for Democracy right now that we didn't get a chance to touch on?
Let me think. Well, so the Naylor Report is definitely the big thing that we're working on, and I think, right now we're focusing on trying to get some commitment in the next budget. But I think realistically, this is going to be a longer campaign push, likely into the next election kind of thing. But we've actually been doing a lot of work on actually training and skills building for scientists. So over the summer, we did a few webinars on government relations for scientists. So that's been really interesting. We're really trying to, sort of take that deconstructed model where, instead of it being us doing the work, we're really trying to empower researchers across the country to be able to be more effective advocates themselves. So that was really great. And we've been also doing some training around how to do a budget submission. These are things that I don't think most people realize, that anybody can submit something to the finance committee around what they want to see in the budget. I think these are, tools in our democracy that are underutilized. And so we're, working on encouraging people to do that kind of thing.
And budding scientists can find all of those details on your website, of course, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's evidencefordemocracy.ca, and we offer a lot of training that's completely free. So check it out.
Great. Well, maybe we'll end there since I think we covered a lot. And
yeah, sounds good.
Where can they find you on Twitter, Facebook, anywhere else?
Yeah, Twitter, I'm at Katie Gibbs, and there's also at E4DCA, and Evidence for Democracy on Facebook.
Well, thank you very much, Katie.
Thank you.
So there was some shenanigans that went on, maybe.
Some tomfoolery,
some skullduggery, I don't know what you call it, at the Supreme Court with respect to the Trinity Western University case, which is a very progressive university that doesn't like the gays so much.
Doesn't care for them. But they would take issue with that characterization.
Yeah, they say some of their best friends are gay.
Yeah, exactly. They say we're totally open to the gays. They just can't be gay while they're at our school. They have to.
Yeah, they just don't like the gay stuff.
And in fact, they can even be gay. They just have to be celibate gays.
Yes.
So, just to be clear.
And I mean, let's be fair. They're also not into, sexual relations before marriage or really anything that's developed since 1920.
I thought you were going to say fun. They're anti-fun.
They do ban drinking.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, Emily is finishing her beer as we record this podcast.
Sign the TW covenant.
Yeah, so this is a law school, proposed law school.
Jinx.
in BC that has a social covenant that students need to sign that bans a whole bunch of social things, but courts have found can run afoul of some very important human rights protections.
And I mean, we've talked about this case before. We can try to remember what episode it was, but technically, what they say is no premarital sex, no sex before marriage, marriage is defined as a union between one man and one woman. So even if you are a legally married gay couple, you cannot engage in sexual activity and respect the covenant because your marriage is not recognized by TWU as a legal marriage. So without necessarily getting into the whole dynamics of the case,
there's been a lot of litigation about it already.
Yes, and we talked about it previously, how the kind of crux of the issue has to do with the provincial regulatory bodies for the legal profession being asked by TWU to accredit this proposed law school, and the Law Society struggling with whether they feel that it's appropriate to effectively endorse a university that imposes this covenant on its students. And maybe you could just tell us a little bit, Ian, about how you've come to be involved with the case.
Sure. I mean, we've sort of always followed it because my organization, the Humanists, is very active at looking at sort of church-state issues, and this has got both of those elements, a university that claims to be church-founded. So we got involved at the BC Court of Appeal level, and we joined in an intervention with the Canadian Secular Alliance, and represented by Tim Dixon, who was at Ferris at the time. We basically made two arguments. First, that opening a law school is actually a secular activity, so claiming that it should be protected under religious freedom shouldn't even meet that sort of test. Like, you know, they can't claim a right to open a law school. It's not in the Bible.
Yeah.
And then we made a sort of second argument that Tim came up with, which I thought was pretty clever, but the courts didn't really engage with, which was this idea that if the Law Society's accredited it, TW claims that it's open to students of all faiths and none, LGBT, straight, doesn't matter, you just have to live by this code. But if the Law Society's accredited, that means that the Law Societies are basically endorsing a coercion of the students, of non-Christian students, of non-straight students, to live by Christian standard. And that's violating those students' two-way rights, their charter of religious freedom.
Yeah,
it was creative.
Yeah, no,
it didn't work,
really
but at least at the BC Court of Appeal, they didn't even get really picked up in the Ontario Court of Appeal ruling either, but we felt we had to make those. So we were a bit disappointed by the BC Court of Appeal ruling, which sided with TWU. At the Supreme Court level in BC, they looked at the Law Society there and saw that they had this really messy process where initially they'd approved it, and then the lawyers in BC got really mad and held a referendum, basically, and voted against TWU, which you can say lawyers are smarter than the average bear and think about constitutional issues before voting, but you could also say this was like rights by popular vote, tyranny of the majority kind of issue.
Yeah.
And so then they struck against TWU, so the Supreme Court there said, this was a messy decision, don't do it that way. TW gets credited, and then the Court of Appeal basically dealt with the constitutional questions and went, no, there's no real discrimination against the LGBTQ community for some reason, and TW should have its law school. Whereas the Ontario Court of Appeal went the exact opposite way and said that discrimination is real and it hurts. Was the actual quote in the ruling.
That's right. I
And
remember
so there's, I mean, this case was going to the Supreme Court regardless, but it's for sure going to the Supreme Court when you have two courts of appeal from BC.
And three, in fact, because Nova Scotia.
That's right.
But Nova Scotia didn't get appealed, but...
Oh,
yeah,
that's
it's
right.
only the
but
Ontario.
but it went to the Court of Appeal.
Yeah.
Right.
But it's only the Ontario and the BC case that are at the Supreme Court. So it was going anyway, but when you have two courts of appeals saying different things, and it matters in Ontario as well, because it's not just a BC issue, because you can go to law school at a BC law school or at any law school and then seek to be accredited in Ontario through the Law Society. But when you have two courts of appeals going different ways, it's for sure going to the Supreme Court, and that's where it is now.
Yeah, and it's interesting, I think, having heard some of the arguments that you guys made in the BC Court of Appeal, because this gets to the crux of the issue that's percolating right now, which has to do with what groups or organizations ought to have intervener status when the Supreme Court considers this issue. And I think the arguments that you alluded to just a minute ago show the role that interveners can play in this type of litigation. So these are not necessarily the types of arguments that Counsel for the Law Society is necessarily going to be making or even really thinking of, because their thinking, is constrained a little bit by the nature of their role in the proceeding. And so this is where, in a case like this, you can expect, and in fact did find in this case, religious groups wanting to intervene, groups like yours, and groups that advocate on behalf of LGBTQ people.
Before we go on, you're a former clerk
yes.
From the Supreme Court. Can you maybe just break down in really simple terms what interveners do, how they're different from parties, how the rules, their roles might be different, and how the approval or granting leave for interveners, how that works, and then from there we can maybe take a look at the unusual aspects of what happened in this case.
Good idea. And in fact, after being a law clerk, I also worked as legal counsel at the Supreme Court. And part of my role had to do with looking at applications for leave to intervene in a case. So without getting into like all the structural parts and the sections of the Act and everything, and this process also exists at the Court of Appeal level, but it's a little bit less common to have interveners granted status at provincial courts of appeal, although as you noted, Ian, before we started recording, it is becoming more common. I think as courts are being asked to weigh in on more and more complicated sort of social policy issues, as one might argue, provincial and federal governments pass the buck a little bit more often. But anyway, that's an aside. So the general rule in litigation is that only parties with the interest, the kind of baseline rule, have standing before the court. So you have to be the aggrieved party or the defendant, or you have to have a direct stake or interest in the outcome of the proceeding in order to have standing, which means to have basically the right to appear before the court and submit arguments. So it's not just everyone who is interested, but it's someone who has a direct personal interest in the case. That's the sort of general rule. But there is scope for groups, as we discussed, to apply to the court and ask permission on the basis of the particular interest group that they represent or a particular expertise that they may have that could assist the court in adjudicating the issue. Whether they might be permitted to file either exclusively written submissions or to be given some time for oral submissions. And this can be particularly helpful in cases where the parties themselves don't necessarily have enormous expertise other than in the very particular way they were impacted by the case. And you want to make sure that if you're making a decision that could actually have very broad implications, that you're aware of what those broad implications could be. And so if you limit the court to hearing only from the aggrieved parties or the parties with a direct stake, you could end up rendering a decision that has unintended consequences or that in fact prejudices another group in a way that hadn't been contemplated. And so anyone who represents a group or even an individual can apply to the court and has to explain to the court why they would bring added value to the process of adjudicating the matter. So it's very common for organizations like the BC Civil Liberties Association, the Criminal Lawyers Association, in criminal cases, for example, to assist the court in understanding what the implications of their decision could be and proposing, reasonable dispositions for the case. So like I said, in this case, there were applications from a wide range of groups with a potential interest. And what happens is they make their pitch to the court initially on an application for leave to intervene on an appeal.
And is that in writing or is that?
That would be done in writing. The application for leave is done in writing. And in that written application, the party sets out why it is they think that they would bring something to the table. Now, it can happen that a number of groups with very similar expertise that they wish to bring to bear can apply, and sometimes the court will invite them to join together. Sounds like that's what happened in your case in the BC Court of Appeal. Is that right? That was
partially from our perspective. We knew we were going to make similar-ish arguments, and they were a few steps ahead of the process in us, so we kind of worked with them, and they were already intervening in other cases.
Okay.
At the Supreme Court Canada, we're now making separate interventions because we've had a bit more time to think and craft slightly different arguments to highlight different issues.
So you can apply jointly, or I believe the court can actually ask you to collaborate. So if three very similar groups apply for leave to intervene, the court may just grant one intervention.
So I
think that's correct.
So like the Dinobots combining into the giant Dinobot.
It's exactly like that. It's exactly the same.
It's the Power Rangers thing, right?
Power Rangers thing, Voltron also.
All these things.
Like that, okay.
So it's not uncommon for parties to be granted only written standing, so they may not be invited to make oral submissions. But as I understand it, since my time at the court, the practice has developed such that for the most part, if you get status, you get at least 5 minutes to make oral submissions.
And who decides that? Who
Right.
reviews your material to decide?
That's right. So applications for leave to intervene are considered by a single judge of the court. Applications for leave to appeal. So if you're the party that's seeking for leave, it's a panel of 3 that considers your application for leave. But if you're, I think this is correct, but if you're applying for intervener status, it's I think it's a single judge that makes that decision. And I think you could say it's not an enormously transparent process. The same is true of applications for leave from parties. So basically you get a one-liner.
I think you can say that. It's a thumbs up or thumbs down by one judge.
You basically get a statement, the application for intervention application for intervention or the application for leave to appeal is allowed or is dismissed, and that's it. So, and you don't have an opportunity to, as a general rule, answer questions or ask why you didn't get leave. You just get it or you don't get it. That's the same if you just want leave to appeal or if you're applying to intervene. So in this case, I'm not sure how many parties applied.
Over 30.
Yeah, so over 30 groups.
It depends if you count them, the joint ones as
Right.
multiple, so there's a lot.
So a lot. And this is a really important case that is going to have impact for a lot of people. So to the surprise of many observers, the Supreme Court, through Justice Wagner, who incidentally happens to be considered one of the front runners to replace the Chief Justice of Canada when she retires.
He's the most senior judge from Quebec, and traditionally the Chief Judge position goes between Anglophone and Francophone. So if that sort of history and custom is observed, it would be someone from Quebec's turn, and Justice Wagner is the most senior judge from Quebec. So a lot of people speculate that he might be the next Chief Justice.
Yeah, and we can get into this more, but whether that happens could be impacted by what happened in this case, I think, because some wonky things happened here. So initially, having considered the applications for leave, Justice Wagner did not grant status to any groups that were seeking to represent the interests of LGBTQ people. I think explicitly. So exactly, or groups whose core mandate was to advocate on behalf of LGBTQ people. Like I understand, for example, the Canadian Bar Association got leave to intervene, and it was their LGBTQ equity committee that applied and was granted.
Right.
So it's not to say that perspective wouldn't be there, but again, like the Canadian Bar Association's perspective may not be the same, or the impacts that they can speak to, may not be the same.
So since he didn't grant leave to those groups, I assume that he didn't grant leave to groups who would be specifically advocating for different religious organizations.
What? False. Now, did you guys get leave initially?
No, we did not.
Okay, so you were among the groups that... So,
right.
So by and large, as I understand it, the groups that got leave, so the CBA got leave. Oh, and look, Ian's got a list of all the groups that you can... You do like research and stuff before you talk about podcasts?
Well, this is from the
crazy.
Press release I wrote.
Okay, so the initially approved groups, I'm just going to read them out because it's interesting. So we're basically organizations with expertise on the legal profession, essentially, or religious groups. So you have...
only some of them.
But not all of them, yeah. So you have the Association for Reformed Political Action Canada.
That's a far-right Christian...
Okay, thank you.
It sounds Christian.
The Advocate Society, which is the organization of barristers, basically, in Canada. The Canadian Bar Association. The Christian Legal Fellowship.
They sound Christian as well.
The International Coalition of Professors of Law.
No one knows anything about them. I Googled them. They only exist as an intervener in this case, as far as I can tell.
The International Coalition.
It's like a shadow body of legal professionals who solve crimes and intervene in cases.
Yeah. The National Coalition of Catholic School Trustees. Okay.
Also Christian.
Lawyers Right Watch Canada. What's that?
It's a small group in BC based out of Vancouver. When I Googled it, they basically do human rights law, but generally international. So
okay. Yay, Google. The Ontario Criminal Lawyers Association, and the CCLA, which is the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. And then the other list that you have are people that sought leave and didn't get it?
Yeah.
Like this, the next bit?
Yeah.
Okay. So it's not the case that every religious-oriented group got leave, but certainly leave was not granted to, for example, what do we have here? The lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans people of the University of Toronto, LGBT out. Start Proud and Outlaws jointly. That's
our law student.
Oh, law students too. The BC LGBTQ Coalition, the West Coast Women Legals Education Action Fund, LEAF, which is a feminist organization.
And they make a very specific argument that the covenant also discriminates against women and feminists because it requires you to uphold the sanctity of life from natural birth to natural death.
Right. So this is a part of the covenant that is a little bit distinct from this, but nonetheless. Okay. So basically you get like a release from the Supreme Court that says these groups have leave, these groups don't have leave. And people were quite surprised to see not a single group directly representing the interests of LGBTQ Canadians.
It was a huge, huge deal on social media. I mean,
which is relevant.
Which, I mean, law professors, legal experts, like involved advocates. I mean, everyone noted this right away. This isn't something that flew under the radar. It was something,
quite the opposite.
Yeah, it was something that, raised a lot of concerns at the outset from, people much smarter than me. Let's put it that way.
And generally the Supreme Court, when it finds itself being publicly criticized, just grins and bears it. Because goes into its shell, hunkers down, and just says, you know what, we stand, well, they don't say it, but by it through its silence sort of projects, we stand by our decision, go to town and criticize it.
Someone on Twitter said that, art and legal decisions should need no justification or explanation.
Oh, really?
I mean, and I take their point. Like, judges normally speak through their decisions. They don't normally need to write a decision, then explain it. The decision should do that. And I guess good art is what it is as well.
Yeah, well, it is what it is. I don't think is the most transparent approach to...
Well, that's the problem here. There wasn't very much transparency. And so I think we're in the unusual situation where there's this unusual, anomalous decision that has it's a thumbs up or thumbs down. There's no explanation at all.
And that's standard, though.
In terms of the interviewers. That's totally standard. But I think one of the unfortunate consequences was that it had people starting to wonder whether the case had been prejudged, whether Justice Wagner had no interest in hearing from a certain perspective because perhaps he didn't care to hear from that perspective. We don't know because there were no reasons provided. But you can see how the court might have, in observing the criticisms of this decision, started to have some real concerns because I would say the kind of threshold after which the court does consider clarifying or speaking out is where public confidence in the institution is being eroded.
Sure. And I think one of the issues initially that Wagner didn't say, but sort of people read in, was this case was set to be heard in one day. And like you mentioned, interveners are generally given 5 minutes. Like in this case, every intervener was allowed to submit 10 pages and 5 minutes of oral arguments. But to do a case in a day where you also have the 2 law societies and TWU all give full arguments on their side and responses, you can't fit that many more.
Right. And so there was quite an uproar. It was, like I said, I think turning into a situation where people were expressing a lack of confidence in the process or in that particular judge. And then something quite extraordinary happened.
So Wagner's decision was on the 27th.
Okay. Yeah, give us the timeline.
The 31st is when we got extra news.
Right. So on the 31st... And initially, I mean, this is the crazy, we talked before about some of the shortcomings of Twitter, but this was really interesting because before it was even on the court's docket or specifically articulated anywhere official, someone posted to Twitter an order of the Chief Justice of Canada varying Justice Wagner's decision and granting intervener status to basically everyone that had applied, I think.
Yeah, everyone.
Right? Everyone who had applied.
And the crazy thing there is nobody can remember this ever happening before, where a decision on leave to intervene had been, overruled by another judge, nor could any of the legal experts find any explicit authority beyond sort of the Chief Justice's, inherent authority to control her court. There's no specific rule that allows an appeal, that allows a variation. And so people were scratching their heads about why it happened, what it means, and how it could have happened.
That's right. So like constitutional experts, Supreme Court experts, law professors were sort of saying, varied in order for leave to intervene? Like, on what basis? Because, everything requires a legal authority.
Well, but it doesn't say you can't do that.
It doesn't say that you can't do it. And also even just the fact that it wasn't Wagner himself varying his order, but that it was the Chief Justice varying the order, itself led to further speculation because there weren't really reasons given for the variance at that time. It was simply an order varying the initial refusal of leave. And so then people were saying, did a party ask for a review of Wagner's decision? And if so, under what authority? And I was seeing a lot of, well, it wasn't us. A lot of the groups were saying, well, we didn't ask for a reconsideration. I mean, they may
directly
have publicly been lamenting and questioning the appropriateness of the decision. And so it led to kind of a second round of social media engagement on the issue.
And I think a bigger one, too.
Probably a bigger one because in part, I think because no one could identify the direct authority for what the Chief Justice had done, and everyone felt that it had likely been driven by the earlier social media outrage. I think that was probably self-congratulatory on some people's part because it was the same people.
And it was much more dramatic. I know I was hearing messages of support just being like, we thought we weren't in, but now we're in. So now it's actually much more exciting than if you'd just sort of gotten in, it would have been, well, of course everyone always gets in.
Exactly.
Well, and I think an important point that I pointed out was...
Must be important.
Of course.
If it was your idea.
Is that this sort of strange development was odd, but maybe was less troubling than if it had been reversed. This wasn't the Chief Justice limiting people's right to participate or limiting interventions. It was adding extra interveners and adding extra time. And it's hard to see much prejudice arising that way, but nonetheless, it was still
unprecedented
and noteworthy, right? And then you can't help, and especially as someone who's worked behind the scenes there, be kind of trying to envision what actually went down. Like, did Wagner get slapped down by the chief? And so I think, so this led to this second round, a kind of speculation of how did this happen, which then led to a second, or I guess at this point now third kind of extraordinary thing, which was an issuance of a press release by the Supreme Court of Canada to explain, to give some context to the Chief Justice's order to vary.
Now, just remind me, was there a comms department in the Supreme Court of Canada when you were there, or like a PR professional?
There's definitely communications because they engage in communications and
but like staff
briefing the media. Yeah, they brief the media when big cases are released and that kind of thing. So, but at the same time, it's not at all common for the court to issue a press release explaining one of its decisions to the public in that way, or explaining it beyond the four corners of a decision. So the communications people might assist the media in understanding the written reasons of the court, but not explain things that haven't been publicly released already, right? So in that press release, the court explained that essentially what had happened, they said, was that that the decision, the initial decision, had been based on time constraint. That at the time that Wagner was making his decision, only one day had been allocated, like you said, Ian, and so he, felt that he had to grant leave only to a certain number that could be heard within the one day. That in a discussion with the Chief Justice, or that it had then been determined that maybe we could actually give 2 days, and that once it was decided that 2 days would be appropriate, it was agreed that further parties could be granted status.
And it was sort of a mutual decision between Justice Wagner and the Chief Justice.
Did it say that in the press release, or did that come out in the subsequent?
No, it was in the press release.
What was in the press release? Most of it's just
Ian has it right here.
I pulled one line that was interesting, and it says, "In this instance, however," because they don't usually give decisions, they set that out because that'd be too much work.
That's right.
Yeah, but they say way too much work.
In this instance, however, the concerns raised by some LGBTQ plus groups and others call for a response.
Others, that's like social media people.
That's us. We're not LGBTQ.
That's right. So, and I think this is very unusual. I don't think it's completely unprecedented for the court to try to clarify or explain. It's very, very, very uncommon, though. And so basically, because of the fact that there was this speculation that maybe Wagner had been slapped down somehow, or that, that they were simply responding to the outcry, they're kind of saying, yes, there was this outcry, but also there were some administrative constraints that had initially been there that we were able to remove, and, like that. So that was very, very odd.
And it explains, the Chief Justice added an extra day, which explains why they can accommodate more interveners. That press release doesn't do anything to explain the initial choice to deny,
who was denied.
Who was denied and who was accepted. Like, that's still unexplained.
It explains the number of interventions that were granted initially, but it doesn't explain why it was weighted one way versus another.
I mean, I think there's a reason to sort of view sort of that, that press release and the change in direction, with a bit of puzzlement.
Well, I think a big part of what they were trying to accomplish with that press release was to push back against the suggestion that Wagner had been overruled by the Chief Justice, as opposed to saying, oh, this was kind of mutually, we sort of sat down and said, you know what, is there a way that we can fix this? And let's fix it. So that was totally weird.
Well, and sorry,
before we move on to the next weird thing.
Other weird thing about this is I can't think of another time that a court, let alone the Supreme Court, has admitted that they've changed their decision due to social media pushback.
Yeah, well, I don't think they admitted that.
They didn't say it specifically, but they talk about concerns raised, and they don't say concerns we were sent. They just say concerns. There's a lot of passive language in there that lets you do whatever you want with
But
it.
I mean, that's pretty stunning to release a decision and then concerns were raised about the Jordan decision, about staying trials because of trial delay. Concerns were raised about a number of decisions. But this is unusual that those concerns, which appear to only have been manifest on social media, actually had the Supreme Court change what it was doing.
That's right, because, actually, Jordan is a great example, because a lot of people were speculating for a long time that the impact of Jordan was not what the court had intended with the decision. And the only time that the court, in fact, clarified that was in the subsequent decision of Cody, when the issue came back before them, and then they took the opportunity to say, no, that was really what we meant when we said what we said in Jordan, and we understand the implications, but you're going to have to figure it out. They didn't issue a press release and say, to all those who say we didn't fully understand what we're, they said nothing, even though they were being heavily criticized and it was being suggested that they had made a mistake. They were silent. So but then what happened, which I just think is really crazy. And
this is the weirdest.
Peter Sankoff, our friend of the podcast, Peter Sankoff, had a Twitter poll. I don't know if you saw it, Ian. He's a professor at the University of Alberta. But he had a poll. What was the weirdest thing about all of this? So the choices they had given were, number one, the initial refusal of leave to the LGBTQ groups. Number two, the variance by the Chief Justice. Number three, the press release. Or number four, what we're going to get into now, which is Justice Wagner gave an interview to Sean Fine of the Globe and Mail to explain what had happened directly. I voted for number four myself. I think this is the craziest part, to have a judge directly engaging with the media, essentially contemporaneously to the unfolding of events before the court, not 20 years later when he's retired and we're looking back and we get a little insight into what happened 20 years ago. This is, and as we mentioned at the beginning, being considered a front runner for Chief Justice, he likely is very concerned about the very public, essentially impugning of his character by some people, implying that he didn't want to hear from this particular perspective, or that he had prejudged the case, or so he actually directly spoke to a journalist to explain. And this is a case that's still before the court too, right? Like, this is not after the fact. The issue of intervention is no longer before the court, but the case hasn't been heard yet. This is really, really, really unusual. And I think it totally blew me away to see Sean Fine saying, in a conversation with the Globe, he explained not only a little bit that, like, I have gay friends too, like I'm an ally to LGBTQ people, but he explained essentially what was in the press release, but a little bit more directly. And he says that he was the one that went to the Chief Justice, not the other way around, and said, is there a solution to be found to this?
Well, and he says, the weirdest part of this bizarre article is Justice Wagner, it says in the article, mentioned that he had given a speech on equality at the University of Ottawa in March. Quote, seeing things from another perspective is both an obligation and a work in progress, he said in the speech. Then he says, I would be the last one to give the false impression that I have no consideration for specific groups like LGBTQ, he said in the interview. The last one. So it sort of is the, wait a second, I'm really, really open. There's this one time back in March where I gave a speech saying that it's really hard sometimes, but we have to try to see things from different perspectives.
Yeah. So, I mean, I have a little concern about, you know, Justice Wagner's appropriateness, suitability to be Chief Justice if this is the way he responds to public criticism. Like if he thinks and don't get me wrong, there's no way he did this without the Chief Justice knowing, probably without discussing it with his colleagues. I would be shocked if he just talked to Sean Fine on his own. But if his instinct, like, I think the press release probably did its job. It is very weird that happened, but I can sort of see how it happened. But if his instinct is like, when people impugn my character or my judgments or whatever, I'm going to go and give an interview to the Globe and Mail, that to me is a red flag about the type of Chief Justice he would be. I don't know.
Is he on Twitter?
Way.
That could add to this.
Way.
Anonymously, probably. I know a bunch of judges who are on Twitter anonymously.
Yeah.
Because I know I've tweeted things and judges have said things to me about like, oh, I see that you said something about that. And I'm like looking through all my followers to see like who it could be. But I mean, I sort of fall into the camp of I like judges to be a bit engaged. I know some in the US, there's some judges who have some very good blogs and who are on podcasts, who are on Twitter. And I mean, I think that that's something that we're going to have to deal with. I agree this sort of seems weird. And like as a non-legal expert in like, what's your
do you make of it?
gut on
It's
this?
definitely weird for me. And what I like about the Canadian legal system is just how nonpartisan it is relative to the States. So what combination of factors makes that the case? I don't know. Mm-hmm. But I think having judges in the front page of the Globe and Mail talking about like how they were on the phone, it's new and different. Maybe it could work out, but
like transparency is good, right?
Yeah.
Like we the more we can understand why a decision is what it is, the more likely it is to be respected or at least understood. But at the same time, the idea that a judge would change his mind, not necessarily because circumstances have changed, but because it turns out people really didn't like it, it calls into question, number one, his chops on the reasoning at the initial state, like that he wouldn't have foreseen that this would be controversial and asked himself, is this the right decision? Is this, if I do have this administrative constraint, is this the right way? Am I achieving an appropriate balance here? And that wouldn't have factored in. Like, that's what I find a little bit wanting about the explanation is that, fine, you only gave leave to a small number, but why exclude completely the kind of perspective that is the most directly implicated?
Well, especially as he said in the Globe and Mail piece, he gave a speech in March saying that seeing things from other perspectives is an obligation and a work in progress, meaning that it's difficult, which it is, and it's odd that interventions wouldn't have been allowed to people with other perspectives to help them accomplish that difficult task.
It's very weird. So in the US, the approach is towards the very wide granting of leave to intervene with written submissions, and very few interveners granted leave to make oral submissions. I'm not sure that giving 5 minutes to everyone is necessarily what makes the most sense. Like, maybe it would make sense to be over-inclusive when it comes to written submissions, but be a little more constrained when it comes to, I mean, speaking from my own experience with the courts, and I think a lot of lawyers and judges would acknowledge that, generally speaking, the written submissions are more important. The oral submissions are important, and the opportunity to ask questions and clarify has an important role, but most, I think, of the kind of real important influential analysis happens at the written stage. So I think you can have a lot of impact even if you're only given leave to give written submissions. But I mean, there are all kinds of people who have looked at this a lot more who would have their views on that. But anyway, so, and again, like I said, because this is still a work in progress. It'll be really interesting to see how it plays out, like how interventionist Wagner will be in the hearing, how much he's going to engage with these particular interveners that weren't initially granted status that got it.
And it may be a good time to revisit, the rules about transparency about the intervention process itself. Maybe there should be some brief reasons provided when you grant or don't grant intervention status, about what factors you considered, or why you came to a decision. And I think that maybe if that had happened in this case, or if it happened as a rule, then in this case we would at least know what the baseline thinking was of the court or of an individual justice at the beginning, so that if things changed, we would know how they changed and why they changed and how much they changed.
I think if we were going to go down that road, we should start with reasons on leave to appeal, like applications for leave to appeal. Because if you're the party seeking leave to appeal a Court of Appeal decision, all you get basically is a yes or no, the application is granted or not. And I think what can be particularly problematic about that is that sometimes the media and others extrapolate from that the Supreme Court is explicitly endorsing or accepting the Court of Appeal decision, which it isn't. It's not saying we think the Court of Appeal was right. It's just saying, based on the criteria, national interest, what the courts of appeal have been doing, we don't feel that we need to hear this case. It doesn't mean that but oftentimes what you'll see in the media is, the Supreme Court upheld or whatever, as opposed to just denied leave to appeal. So it would be helpful if people knew, is it because the issue is just not ripe yet? It needs to percolate more in the lower courts before it's really ready for the Supreme Court to intervene?
Or it's not an issue of national importance, or, but I think, we project sort of our thinking onto the court's reasoning in those cases. And I think you also have to be careful in this case not to project onto the court, because, the Chief Justice is retiring. We've had, under the last government, a public fight between the Supreme Court and the government. We had a judge appointed to the Supreme Court who was then disqualified by the Supreme Court. We had a conversation when Justice from Newfoundland, Malcolm Rowe was appointed. There was, questions about different factors, about regional diversity, about ethnic diversity, about bilingualism. And we're going to have those conversations about who the next judge is to replace Justice McLaughlin and who the next Chief Justice is. And so it might be easy to project sort of all of those political considerations and appointment considerations onto this process and try to tease out meanings where there may not be any meaning at all. It might have just been a fuck up.
But I still think it could have an impact, because the Prime Minister is going to be very reticent to appoint a Chief Justice that is now tainted with a public perception that he's either homophobic, which I don't think is a fair extrapolation, but some people were kind of saying, is he already prejudiced against certain groups? I think the appointment of the new Chief Justice is already pretty fraught for the Prime Minister. And we've talked about this before, how the 3 Quebec judges are relatively junior. So whoever gets appointed is going to be Chief Justice for a long time. And so if you get it wrong, you're under the current system and convention basically stuck with that person for a while. This, I think, is going to be at least irking the people that are tasked with trying to make that decision with this kind of make things, I think, just a little more complicated.
Well, and in sort of a renewed focus on diversity, you already have a upper class white male who, is viewed as the front runner, or 2 white females. So, there's already all those considerations. So, I think it's easy, especially when you're the media looking at these things. You can project things onto the scenario to make it, as sexy and House of Cardish that you want it to be. But even removing all of that, it's bizarre.
Agreed. Thank you for joining us, Ian. This was really fun.
Thank you both for having me.
And that has been Politicos. Find links to the stories you mentioned in the show notes at politicos.ca. Make sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at PoliticosPod. Leave us a review and let us know what you think. Support the show and get early access to our interviews at patreon.com/Politicos. And if you have ideas for the show, feel free to send them to us. Thanks for listening.